All right. I said I wasn't going to do another video unless there was news. Well, there's news. The Lions second-year wide receiver Jameson Williams is now unsuspended, I guess, by the NFL. He can play as early as next week. To not bury the lead on this one, like if you're wondering what are my thoughts, like Jameson Williams is probably going to be the epitome of a boom bust wide receiver, somewhere between like low end wide receiver 2 range and like a high end wide receiver 3. Like I said, I'm not that interested in him. I'm probably going to be more scared of him being in my opponent's lineup than I am excited for him to be in my lineup, which means that if I have him, he's going to sit on my bench and I'm going to be like, man, I wish I would have played him when he dropped 30. And again, I just don't want him to be in my opponent's lineup when he does it to me. That's kind of the long and short of him. So if anybody else that wants to hang around for the next few minutes and hear me ramble about like how this would function in my mind from a fantasy perspective through the real X's and O's, like you're more than welcome to, but you know, whatever. So anyway, from a fantasy perspective, I have last year's stats with Justin Jefferson being the wide receiver 1. He led all wide receivers with 184 targets. That's roughly about 11 targets per game. If I'm not mistaken, Cooper Kupp was on pace for like 12 or 13 before he got injured. That's the high volume. Just because you have targets doesn't mean that you're going to put up fantasy stats, but it makes it easier when you have more opportunities, right? Opportunities being the king of fantasy football. So a wide receiver that operates in that 8 target range either has to be ridiculously efficient with his targets. That means he's catching them all, or he has to essentially like have big plays and not catch them all. That's the way those guys get there. So just volume, targets are a good way to look at it. So from a fantasy perspective, remember, good at football doesn't equal good for fantasy. And sometimes it's better to have great pieces on okay-ish offenses with very little competition for opportunity than it is to have a great player on a great offense that is not predictive of his usage from week to week. Your Eagles and AJ Brown and Devontae Smith. So again, the X's and O's being from a football perspective, and I can move on a little bit. They're the wide receiver positions, the receiver positions. The names of them are going to be changed from offense to offense, but generally, like you have your X, your Y, your Z, your slot, which could be called your H. The power or the X position is the guy who plays up on the line of scrimmage. He's going to get a lot of jams. The Z plays off, and he can get moved around the formation. That's probably what Jameson Williams is going to play. I have Josh Reynolds is probably going to stay in that power X spot. He's got the length to beat press, and then that allows Jameson Williams' athleticism to be used in other ways. I'm not going to call Jameson Williams a technician. That doesn't mean that I don't think he runs routes well. It's just not what I necessarily would care about him doing if I had him in my offense. And then the slot and the Y usually being called the inline tight end is the Y, and then the slot or the H or whatever you want to call him. In this offense, it would probably be Amon-Ra St. Brown playing in the slot. And then Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the best when it comes to short and intermediate routes. He's probably going to stay in that role. So Jameson Williams acting as quote unquote the decoy is just going to allow him to do what he does already elite better. But you have the problem that some weeks Jameson Williams is going to take targets away from the other guys in the offense, like Amon-Ra St. Brown. So Laporta, again, another big slot wider. He can go outside and he can play that power X because of the athleticism. A sub 4'6", 40 tight end, 6'3", 245. He can just play that bully. Again, and he can stretch the seam from the slot. Going to be benefited by having Jameson Williams doing sub 4.4 things, right? And then finally, I talked about this in the other video with Gibbs. You can't come up and rally to Gibbs when you have Jameson Williams putting pressure on corners and safeties. It's just not going to work the same way. So that's part of the reason why I was like, hey, maybe I'm going to buy on Jahmyr Gibbs. And to further give you guys some background, I know some of you have written in the comments that you like hearing me ramble about how things work from a coaching perspective. The game has changed a lot from when I played with like leather helmets. I don't know how much I've already repeated some of this because I've done so many takes, but a lot of the smaller imperfect prospects have been running routes from flag football from like the time they were like 7 years old, that they're really, really good at it. And that's why they can get into the NFL, and there's no development time, and they could just start doing what they do really well. And teams can just not have to worry about the stuff that they don't do well, because they can hide them. And I have Chris Olave brought up because part of the drop off in Chris Olave's performance last year was when teams started to realize that they could bully him when he was playing in that X slot. Then that just took away what they could do. So some of the tape I've seen on Olave this year, they're actually moving around the formation, putting him in motion. Another example would be the Miami Dolphins, what they're doing, so teams can't bully these guys on the line of scrimmage. I have Chris Olave's game logs, and you can see that drop from when he looked like he was going to be a league winner at 13, 14, and 9 targets a game, and then he becomes less efficient as the season goes on, because when teams could bully him, they could just kind of take him away. So I kind of don't think that the Lions are going to be putting Jameson Williams in those positions, because they don't need to, because they have all these other weapons. And so another example of this would be like Jordan Addison with the Vikings. He's going to get the targets that are vacated when teams decide to take away Justin Jefferson. And we've already kind of see that. So Jameson would kind of be that Jefferson role, where he's pulling coverage away, but he doesn't need to be Justin Jefferson, because he's got other really good weapons within the offense. So they're not going to have to lean on Jameson Williams to win. They need to lean on Jameson Williams to allow the other guys that do other things well to do what they do well, so he can do what he does well. So that's going to limit his ability. So there's almost no way Jameson Williams is going to be in that Justin Jefferson like 12 targets a game range. So now it becomes an issue of like trying to figure out like what he would look like from a fantasy perspective. And Olave is not a particularly bad comparison last year. Probably a little bit more boom on Jameson Williams' standpoint. I would say, like, if you're aware of Deshaun Jackson, probably another apples to apples comparison. A guy that I'm going to be more worried about being in my opponent's lineup because of that spike week than I would ever want to have in my week, because I'm just not going to be able to predict it. And then he's going to be a roster clogger. So depending on how your lineup and your bench are constructed, that's how I would value him. So it's not something that I could just go like, oh yeah, everybody should go out there and do this. It's going to be very specific. Are you worried about someone in your league, a team that's really wide receiver thin? This is another guy that you should know what you're paying for. Throwing him in that wide receiver 2 role, that flex role, and just waiting for the week that he just wins it for you single-handed, because he's probably not going to have very many 40-degree days. It's going to be feast or famine. So anyway, that's about all I got. Hopefully I like this one, and it's relatively short, and there isn't any more news today.